Good evening, everyone, and welcome in person and as well as online to this program of Massachusetts Historical Society. My name is Kenneth Horn-Wong-Sri-Chanalai. I'm the Director of Research here at the MHS. And if you are joining us for the first time, I'd like to extend a special welcome to you. The Massachusetts Historical Society, if you do not know us, is the oldest historical society in the nation. We maintain a research library as well as some remarkable collections, and we make all of these collections and items free for researchers and for folks who are interested in the past. We host a variety of programs related to Massachusetts as well as American history. And we have some great programs coming up. Now, we have several types of programs. We have seminars where scholars are workshopping their material for chapters and essays that have yet to be published. We have book talks, we have discussions about books, we have panel discussions. So there's a little bit of something for everyone. And we are only able to host these programs and seminars thanks to the support of our members. We encourage you to visit our website at masshis.org and see what's coming up and see how you can help us out as well. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our two discussants tonight. They're two wonderful scholars. Mary Bilder is Founders Professor of Law at Boston College Law School. Her research revolves around the Constitution, the founders, the history of judicial review, and colonial and founding era constitutionalism. She is the author of The Transatlantic Constitution, Colonial Legal Culture and Empire, as well as Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention, which won the 2016 Bancroft Prize in American History and Diplomacy, as well as the James C. Bradford Prize for Biography from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic, and was the finalist also for the George Washington Book Prize. She will be in a conversation with Dr. Sara Georgini, who is the series editor for the papers of John Adams, part of the Adams Papers editorial project here at the MHS. And she is the author of Household Gods, The Religious Lives of the Adams Family. She's also a frequent writer about early American thought and culture for Smithsonian. So, Drs. Bilder and Georgini.
Thank you so much, Kid, and welcome to all of you near and far who are joining us tonight, and welcome back to the Historical Society, Mary.
It's just so nice to be here. Thanks. I'm really looking forward to it. I know we had so much fun just talking about what we were going to talk about.
We absolutely did, and we want to get right into the mysterious life, I think, of a woman who was so famous in her own day and maybe has been lost a little bit to history until now with female genius. And I think you give us a really brilliant portrait of Eliza Harriot as a woman who's at the crossroads of everything, of empires, of politics, of gender roles, of educational opportunities. And as I was reading your book, I thought, you know, it's so difficult to write good women's history, to balance narrative and speculation, given the sources that we have to work with. And I think you do an excellent job of balancing manuscripts and material culture, using everything from newspaper ads to an embroidery box. So can you tell us a little bit about how you met Eliza and how you built her story on the page?
Yeah, it's so interesting to me, and it was so interesting in terms of Kid's introduction, because it started when I was working on my last book, which was Madison's Hand, which is about James Madison's experience writing at the convention and his notes. And I read for that project, I read a lot of diaries of that summer, you know, anybody who had summer of 1787. And one of the sources I really like is George Washington's diary. He kept a diary in that summer when he was in Philadelphia. And there's this entry where he says, you know, he was in town, he's waiting for everybody else to show up. Nobody else is showing up, none of the other delegations. And he says, I went to hear a lady lecture at the college hall. And I was like, that's, you know, kind of interesting. Like, who is that? But then I went on to write about James Madison. Okay. And it bothered me. It stuck with me. I was like, who is she? What is she doing? What does it mean? And then I think he rewrites his diary in the fall at Mount Vernon that year. And he says she was tolerable. And that's the language for us Jane Austen fans. That's what Mr. Darcy says about Eliza Bennet. So first time he meets her. So I was like, there's something else going on here. And when I finished the Madison book, I went back to be like, could I figure out who that was? Could I understand what she was doing? And could I understand Washington's reaction to her? And that was where I first met her. And figuring out who she actually was is a little bit tricky. Washington doesn't even give her her correct name. And the book, we can tell more about the story, but uncovering her was really a wonderful experience of using some really traditional sources, and then also using this just remarkable world that we can now do because so many late 18th century newspapers are digitized on both sides of the Atlantic. And so we can actually find people who we couldn't usually find. And we can trace people, and we can suddenly see that she has an ad here, and then the exact same language pops up in another place. And so we can reconstruct her life. And a lot of the book is sort of done through this just remarkable ability you can do now with digitized newspapers.
And she has actually a couple of names. You've made a really big choice in calling her Eliza Harriot.
Yeah, so it was, I mean, there's a small problem with that because people think her last name's Harriot, and so that's not. So she was born Elizabeth Harriot Barons. And for those of us in Boston, her father was Benjamin Barons. He was the port collector during the very famous writs of assistance case, and John Adams said that there the revolution was born. And so she was born Elizabeth Harriot Barons, and she marries an Irish Catholic lawyer in London from Dublin, who basically is from Sligo, named John O'Connor. And so at that point, her name is really Eliza Harriot Barons O'Connor. And when you write about women's history, you have the struggle, like, what do you call the person? And if you call them by their last name, you conflate them some ways with their husband, and you sort of are trapping them, in my sense, in the kind of coverture of which they were trapped themselves, really defined by their husbands or by their fathers. And I struggled with this a lot, trying to think about how to write about her. Linda Colley writes about this. How do we write about women? And in the end, in her will and in the 4 letters she writes to Washington, she signs herself Eliza Harriot O'Connor. And in her will, she signs herself Eliza Harriot. And I decided that that was the part of her name that she had called herself. It was a diminutive of her first name. She obviously chose to use her middle name. And so she became, for me, Eliza Harriot. And her husband's Per John, and George Washington gets to be Washington. So he does get his last name. But it was very important to me to think of her in her own way about what she could claim for herself, because her own life story was so much about her experience of pushing boundaries and figuring out how to define herself.
Getting back to that life story, how do you build her earliest years? She travels quite a bit as a young woman.
Yeah, she reminds us so much of this world that I think we sometimes forget about a very mobile British society, a very mobile American society in some respects. She was born in 1749 in Lisbon, Portugal. And she's born to British parents who were at what was called the British factory.
You've made a really big choice in calling her Eliza Harriot.
Yeah, so it was, I mean, there's a small problem with that because people think her last name's Harriet, and so that's not. So she was born Elizabeth Harriot Barons. And for those of us in Boston, her father was Benjamin Barons. He was the port collector during the very famous writs of assistance case, and John Adams said that there the revolution was born. And so she was born Elizabeth Harriot Barons, and she marries an Irish Catholic lawyer in London from Dublin, who basically is from Sligo, named John O'Connor. And so at that point, her name is really Elizabeth Harriot Barons O'Connor. And when you write about women's history, you have the struggle, like, what do you do? It was kind of like a trading outpost for the British elite. And her father is part of a sort of merchant group. Her mother's family is very prominent in the Admiralty. And they're kind of rising up in British society through naval service and Admiralty. And her uncle is a man called Sir Charles Hardy. He will be the head of the British fleet during the Revolution. He will be governor of New York. And her other uncle, Josiah Hardy, is also the governor of New Jersey. So on her mother's side of the family, she's sort of a person who understands patronage politics. She's a person who understands the ways you can, you have to sort of please powerful people in order to rise. And her father's early career is run by basically the brother-in-laws. Her uncles, her father will move to Boston to be port collector, a position that his wife's family probably got for him. He will eventually become secretary to them. And so she probably was in New York also as a young girl, possibly, and then possibly in Charleston, where her father was appointed for a very brief time as the as the postal head of the postal service there. So she's a person who goes back and forth across the Atlantic as a young woman, and then spends some time in boarding school, which is probably a formative experience for her. And so she reminds us of that kind of like world where the ocean didn't loom as large as sometimes those of us who do American history think.
And what do we have in her own words? What kind of archive are you dealing with when you think about capturing those travels?
Yeah, so that's all of that is reconstructed out of nothing about her. It's reconstructed either out of clues from newspaper ads that she places later on, or from one of the 5 letters that we have left of hers. And so let me talk about the letters first. There are 5 letters known that Eliza Harriot O'Connor wrote. 4 of them were to George Washington, which she was very fortunate about because then they were all saved because they're very important. And one of them was to Benjamin Franklin's daughters, Sara Franklin Bache, in Philadelphia. There are probably more letters of hers, but when you're just Elizabeth O'Connor in an archive, I don't think the letters rise to the same level. She had no children, and that reminds us of how important family is in letters and papers being preserved. And she dies basically not penniless, but impoverished, living in someone's house. So the type of property ownership or family that would have allowed her papers to be kept, like the way the Adams kept everything, that is not open to her. And in that sense, the fact that we can recover her at all is pretty amazing. It's a testament to the fact that she places newspaper ads. There's close to 150 newspaper ads in Philadelphia and over 300 ads of hers that I was able to find during the basically 10 years she's placing ads. So she lives through that ability of showing up in newspapers.
And she very much builds a career that I think of as owning a real golden age in the late 18th, early 19th century, specializing in oratory, rhetoric, being a women's educator. How does she get on that career path? And what are kind of the nuts and bolts of that job as we might understand it today?
Yeah, she's educated as a young woman at a school that she describes herself in her ads as being educated, Mrs. Aylesworthy. And we're lucky about this because Aylesworthy's school was also where John Wilkes, the great sort of British revolutionary's daughter was. And they were contemporaries. They would have known each other. And Tobias Smollett's daughter is also a contemporary, and they're at the same time. So she's educated at a school which was emphasizing French, emphasizing the kind of Enlightenment education that this type of British girls' education gave, and at a school that obviously had reformist impulses, because John Wilkes isn't going to send his daughter to a school that's a super conservative school. And then she's in London during just this remarkable time in the late 1770s and 1780s, when, for example, women's debating societies are flourishing and women actively debate and advertise whether women should have political power, should they have seats in Parliament. She's in England at this time when we know that so many women novelists begin, when sort of the rise of the novel, the rise of the circulating library. And then she's in Dublin with her husband during a moment when this sort of elocutionist culture is really at its height. The notion is that you could learn to speak better and speak out loud, and that would be good training for men in terms of going into politics or the church or being a lawyer. But it was also seen in Dublin very much as as something that women should participate in. And so we have this moment where I argue in the book a lot of women were in this group were beginning to think that there would be a space where you could finally get rid of this notion that women were inferior. And the way you could do that was by showing that women had, and this is where the title comes from, female genius. You could claim genius capacity for yourself. And you would do that by then allowing women to have access to the same kind of education men did. And so she brings that she represents that space moving across the Atlantic.
So how long would she speak for? What were some of her go-to topics?
Yeah, so just to fill people in, she runs a very successful one-year female academy in New York. And if she gave speeches in New York, I don't know about them. In New York, I just have to tell people this. In New York, she has like the daughters of the fanciest people at her school, and running in French, and runs the ads in French, saying that there will be freedom of religion at her school, basically, so that it's not just for Protestants, it's also for people who would be Catholic or be dissenters. And at the end of the term, she gives exams. She has her young women do exams. And she says there's not enough room in her school building to do the exams. So she has prevailed upon the professors of Columbia College. And so she has the young women examined at Columbia College with the Columbia professors. So this is incredible ambition. You know, you're running a women's academy, but you're basically showing up at Columbia, which is more like a high school at that time. And, you know, look, my girls can do just as well as the people you graduate. She goes to Philadelphia with her husband in the spring of 1787 when the convention is gathering. And that's where she really begins to become a lecturer. And she offers a course of lectures at the university. And to my knowledge, she is the first woman public lecturer, certainly of the size of the audience she was getting, and in a university setting. And so she says the lady will give a course of lectures at the university. So she's claiming the space that men spoke of. The most, you know, Noah Webster will speak there. The head of Princeton speaks there, and she puts herself into that space. As it's very exciting, you know, where Noah Webster, or the most people, that she is going to give a lecture, and her lectures. At one point, she says, you know, I even spoke for almost an hour and a half. So it was a pretty long lecture. But she does a variety of readings, and we can talk more about that. But it's a pretty remarkable, there is nobody else in her specific generation like her.
To me, that this kind of opportunity, she drags a pretty heavy spotlight. She's really good at finding an audience wherever she goes. How does she do that, and who's in the seats?
Yeah, so this is where it probably helps that she's very sophisticated about patronage politics. You know, she grows up pretty sophisticated about pleasing powerful people. She starts in April giving lectures, but the really important thing for her is when the convention occurs and people start showing up, she obviously would like to have the most important person in the entire United States come to her lecture. So she delays her lecture by one day so that Washington can come. She says she was supposed to give it one day, and then suddenly it's being given the next day, and Washington attends her lecture. She's emphasizes a female audience, and Washington goes to the lecture with Mary White Morris and women. So she's really emphasizing a female audience in addition to a male audience. She will eventually, she creates a second lecture series later on the faculties of the human mind. And for that lecture series, she actually advertises that a ticket will get 3 ladies or 2 ladies and a man. I don't know if she's going to exclude. I don't know if she's excluding people or whatever. But throughout her advertisements, she emphasizes the importance of women attending. When she goes on to run schools, she will have a day that's almost like an open reading day, and she will actually say that those are for women who might not have had the advantage of being able to go to an education, to come and be educated. So older women. And we know from the reports in the newspaper, which she probably wrote, that that a number of women attend her lecture. So I think a very exciting moment and a mixed audience.
Mm-hmm. Do we have any idea, just thinking about this incredible convention backdrop and kind of the hot swarm of politics that's happening right around this period, do we have a sense of her politics? Do we know, for a woman who traveled as much as she did, especially between North and South, what she thinks about the duality of liberty and slavery?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's where, when you've got 5 letters and some school advertisements, but luckily her husband, this is where I think her husband helps us understand her advertisements, and then we can look back at her advertisements and be like, oh yes, we can see it. Her husband, John O'Connor, was Irish at a time when the Irish penal laws are being pulled away. He does not conform to Protestantism until the very last minute, which he has to do to get his kings in. And he goes on to try and write a lot of things. He has a lot of plans, and they don't work out at all, which is why she always has to have a job. But he is clearly a sort of a part of this transatlantic reform political culture. And he imagines himself living in this great age where all of the things that had sort of held people down were being lifted. And he actually imagines the United States as being part of a global sort of empire of liberty. He sort of talks like that. So now where can we position her and him in that? They're reformers, they're political reformers, they're people who probably would have been aligned with, for example, the contemporary move in England to end the transatlantic slave trade that summer. I feel quite comfortable that that's where they would be. With respect to within the United States with race, we don't know. And this is a thing that the book struggles with. How do we understand her with respect to this, with slavery? Because slavery was legally practiced in all of the places she lived. And, if in a Hollywood movie version, you pretend she had been a certain kind of person. There's no evidence for that. And I'm really careful about that in the book. She moves progressively south. She will follow the King's Highway going south, and her school will be most successful in Charleston, and she will end her life in Columbia. And the reason her school is very successful in Charleston for the time that she's in it is probably because of the advantages that being a white woman who calls herself a lady has in an economy like Charleston's, which is so built on enslaved labor. And so there's a financial benefit she has by being a white woman in a place where enslaved labor was relatively easy to hire. There's a fact that she's more successful in Charleston probably because the product she's selling, being educated as a lady, has a lot of meaning in a culture that has deep advantages about white privilege and white supremacy. So they probably are in the census. In the census, they show up in Charleston without owning someone. And I would like to think that they never actually participated that directly in slavery. But like I think many people within political reform communities in this period, they imagine liberty, they imagine doing away with the slave trade, they may imagine aspects of slavery fading. They still participate and benefit from that world.
You mentioned that she had kind of a variety of readings that she often tapped. And in thinking about female genius as an intellectual biography, do you kind of see the fingerprints of who's influencing her? Like, who are some of her favorite thinkers who are shaping her curriculum or her talks? Yeah,
this is where I had so much fun. I mean, one of the great things about writing a book is you learn so much stuff, so my poor family had to learn it all with me, and my dogs know a lot too, because I tell them things when I walk the dogs in the morning. So I just learned all this stuff that I didn't know. And so some of what she reads is Shakespeare. She reads Shakespeare, but she also reads Milton. Milton is in this period really understood as a reformist poet. She reads a poet called James Thompson, who was really associated with political reform in this period. Washington will end that summer buying a book of James Thompson. So we can see in some ways the connection. So she's She does it. She is the first person, as far as I can tell, to publicize the works of Sir William Jones. And Sir William Jones was a political reformer, a very important person. She will actually read his translations of various poets that summer. So very key person in that regard. She gives, very importantly, parts of readings by a woman named Madame de Genlis, who was the first woman appointed as an educator for the French royal family, and who had written a whole series of works on educating young children, particularly educating women. So she's in conversation with women. And then, very importantly, she like a moment that actually gets in the paper, she gives the prayer of Demosthenes from the Crown. And this is the sort of set piece. It will become the set piece of 19th century oration, the Demosthenes on the Crown. I mean, it's so famous that Mark Twain's war prayer is based on it. And she delivers the sort of set piece of the Demosthenes prayer. And we know this because the newspapers pick this up as a critique of the fact that the Rhode Islanders won't show up at the convention. And so and I don't know if she implied that or whether that's just picked up, but they actually say the prayer as part of that. So we can locate her in a elocutionist culture. We can locate her in a women's culture. And then, very importantly, we can locate her in the sort of political reform culture.
And how does the press respond?
You know, when you've got 5 letters and some school advertisements, but luckily her husband, this is where I think her husband helps us understand her advertisements, and then we can look back at her advertisements and be like, oh yes, we can see it. Her husband, John O'Connor, was Irish at a time when the Irish penal laws are being pulled away. He does not conform to Protestantism until the very last minute, which he has to do to get his kings in. And he goes on to try and write a lot of things. He has a lot of plans, and they don't work out at all, which is why she always has to have a job. But he is clearly a sort of a part of this transatlantic reform political culture. And he imagines himself living in this great age where all of the things that had sort of held people down were being lifted. And he actually imagines the United States as being part of a global sort of empire of liberty. You know, he sort of talks like that. So now, where can we position her and him in that? They're reformers, they're political reformers, they're people who probably would have been aligned with, for example, the contemporary move in England to end the transatlantic slave trade that summer. I feel quite comfortable that that's where they would be. With respect to within the United States with race, we don't know. And this is a thing that the book struggles with. How do we understand her with respect to this, with slavery? Because slavery was legally practiced in all of the places she lived. And, you know, if in a Hollywood movie version, you pretend she had been a certain kind of person, there's no evidence for that. And I'm really careful about that in the book. She moves progressively south. She will follow the King's Highway going south, and her school will be most successful in Charleston, and she will end her life in Columbia. And the reason her school is very successful in Charleston for the time that she's in it is probably because of the advantages that being a white woman who calls herself a lady has in an economy like Charleston's, which is so built on enslaved labor. And so there's a financial benefit she has by being a white woman in a place where enslaved labor was relatively easy to hire. There's a fact that she's more successful in Charleston probably because the product she's selling, being educated as a lady, has a lot of meaning in a culture that has deep advantages about white privilege and white supremacy. So they probably are in the census. In the census, they show up in Charleston without owning someone, and I would like to think that they never actually participated that directly in slavery. But like I think many people within political reform communities in this period, they imagine liberty, they imagine doing away with the slave trade. They may imagine aspects of slavery fading. They still participate and benefit from that world.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that she had kind of a variety of readings that she often tapped. And in thinking about female genius as an intellectual biography, do you kind of see the fingerprints of who's influencing her? Like, who are some of her favorite thinkers who are shaping her curriculum or her talks?
Yeah, this is where I had so much fun. I mean, one of the great things about writing a book is you learn so much stuff, you know. So my poor family had to learn it all with me, and my dogs know a lot too, because I tell them things when I walk the dogs in the morning. So I just learned all this stuff that I didn't know, and so some of what she reads is Shakespeare. She reads Shakespeare, but she also reads Milton. Milton is in this period really understood as a reformist poet. She reads a poet called James Thompson, who was really associated with political reform in this period. Washington will end that summer buying a book of James Thompson. So we can see in some ways the connection. So she does it. She is the first person, as far as I can tell, to publicize the works of Sir William Jones. And Sir William Jones was a political reformer, a very important person. She will actually read his translations of various poets that summer. So very key person in that regard. She gives very importantly parts of readings by a woman named Madame de Genlis, who was the first woman appointed as an educator for the French royal family, and who had written a whole series of works on educating young children, particularly educating women. So she's in conversation with women. And then very importantly, she, like a moment that actually gets in the paper, she gives the prayer of Demosthenes from the Crown. And this is the sort of set piece. It will become the set piece of 19th century oration, the Demosthenes on the Crown. I mean, it's so famous that Mark Twain's war prayer is based on it. And she delivers the sort of set piece of the Demosthenes prayer. And we know this because the newspapers pick this up as a critique of the fact that the Rhode Islanders won't show up at the convention. And so and I don't know if she implied that or whether that's just picked up, but they actually say the prayer as part of that. So we can locate her in a elocutionist culture. We can locate her in a women's culture. And then very importantly, we can locate her in sort of political reform culture.
And how does the press respond to her?
Yeah, well, the press is mostly her, as far as I can tell. She places advertisements. She places almost every day of the summer of 1787, there is an advertisement by her in one of the Philadelphia newspapers. And then she or her husband write to the newspapers from a correspondent. And the correspondent is always praising the lady lecturer in all sorts of ways. And the correspondent explains that George Washington went to see her. So then every newspaper in the United States, that's a slight exaggeration, but if George Washington comes to see the lady lecturer lecturing at the university, it's picked up by all the newspapers. It goes viral. So across the United States, in the newspapers in most of the major cities, you can find this notice about her and other notices because of Washington's attendance. And very importantly, she writes a description of the lady lecturer, what she's doing, by saying that Europe will see that basically women in the United States have deserted the toilette and the parlor, so the private space and the semi-private space, for the college and the forum. And that's what she understands herself as doing, as being an image of moving towards the college and the political forum. And that piece gets picked up by other newspapers too. So she has this immediate impact in Philadelphia. and then through this kind of what we would now think of as social media amplification that the newspapers do in this period, she shows up in other places in the United States.
And certainly the person who dominates the newspapers so much is Washington. And I kind of have to ask, Now that you have focused on Eliza and are looking from her perspective, how does Washington look different to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, one, you realize like everybody was trying to trade on Washington's influence. I mean, you see this, right? And I am too, because he's in the title of my book. I learned something from my subject. Washington symbolized so many things. He's the general at this point, and he's one of the few people who's persistently calls his excellency through this period. He notices her. He goes to see her. That's really important. He explains that he thinks she must be reduced in circumstances because she had to do this to make some money, which is actually interesting if you think about it. He's a little bit uncomfortable with her, but he also can imagine women having to make money. And he describes her as tolerable, which is less of, it has more of an accepting meaning in the 18th century. And so he has some capacity, very importantly, to be open to this kind of education. And we know this also about Washington because he buys, on his way out of Philadelphia, he buys 3 books that were influenced by her. He buys this book of James Thompson poems. He buys James Berg's The Art of Speaking, which is what she was doing, this idea that elocution would help you. And he buys modern geography because what she offered in her girls' school was also geography. So we can see him being influenced by her. And when he sends, he has to pick an education school for his, I never can remember, nieces or grandnieces. He picks a school that looks very much like her kind of school. And then he's supportive of her school. She opens a school in Alexandria, and he's supportive of that. So, he's not completely embracing of it, but I think he shows us that there's an openness to this in the period.
And it's also a good window into him as a lifelong student. We might not think of him necessarily as the general who picks up books after the book talk, right? And yet he is.
Yeah, I mean, he's actually, and this is not in the book at all, but he's really interesting as a reader. I mean, he's really interesting as a reader. A book, this is not at all in my book, so if you want to know about this, you can't read this book. But here's an interesting book. That summer, he buys a book called Life of Buncle, which is like a crazy book about a guy who's in Ireland, and it's understood as a proto-Unitarian book. And this guy in Ireland goes on this sort of, journey, travels, and at every place on that journey, who he meets is a remarkable woman who turns out to be Unitarian, and it's a sort of it's like a really interesting book, and Washington buys that, like it's and so he's like, he might have some more depth in some of these areas. He's also really important in this book because he reminds us of the realities of male political power, of white male political power in this period. And so he's both in some ways an individual in conversation with her, but he also really reminds us there's a reality about political power that he embodies.
Mm-hmm. And setting it just in Philadelphia at that moment, how are women like Eliza in those conversations? How are they in dialogue with constitutional development as it happens, if at all?
Yeah, so this was a thing that I've been really interested in for a long time. Very importantly, Mary Beth Norton, Linda Kerber, really just thinking hard about how do we think about women in the constitutional state. And one of the arguments that this book makes is that that women, at least Eliza Harriot, is making a difference in that argument, that she's imagining women as participating in the constitutional state, that the boundaries and exclusions that will come to dominate the 19th century, both in terms of racial exclusions and gender exclusions, are not yet set in place. The ideas about power may be there, but those really pernicious written exclusions that show up in constitutions so that only white male citizens can participate, that's not yet figured out completely. And so in this space in the 1780s, there's this book tries to remember this moment where there's contingency about that, and where the idea that women could be educated and could show they are not inferior and therefore would be allowed to participate in politics was a possibility. And that's true also for people of color in certain ways. So this is the period when the first person of color votes in England. Mm-hmm. It's this moment when property and religious qualifications are fading, and the kinds of race and gender-based classifications in the 19th century haven't risen. Mm-hmm. And so to claim that you could be educated, to claim you have capacity, is to make a claim to participate in politics. And I argue that's what she's doing. That's what she's doing here. And that's important to remember, that in New Jersey, women and people of color vote in this period. And so this book is in conversation with that fact as helping us to explain, it's going to go in a different direction, but everybody doesn't yet know that it's going to go in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Circling back to where we started, kind of how you meet her and how you keep her in mind, do we know what she looked like? Do we have anything that she may have owned that could give you a clue to her daily experience?
Yeah, I so searched for a portrait of hers. But if you look for Eliza O'Connor portrait, first of all, you get a lot of portraits. If you look for anonymous lady, you get tons. So I actually think there's probably a portrait of her out there. It's just not known. I'm really lucky in the sense that her mother's family was wealthy enough that there are two really wonderful portraits of her uncle. George Romney did a portrait of her uncle, and there's a wonderful Thomas Lawrence portrait of her cousin that's in private hands that Bonhams was nice enough to let me reproduce in the book. And so you have some sense of, I'm like, maybe she had the nose, I don't know, maybe the chin. Who knows what she looks like, but it does give you a sense of certainly the social aspirational class she grew up in. And then we can tell a little bit about what she wore, mm-hmm. which is interesting to me, because one of the things she cared about teaching at her school was that she taught embroidery at her school, and she emphasized that she would teach useful and ornamental sewing. And she explained that the reason she wanted to teach ornamental sewing was that so by your own labor, you could basically create the kind of clothes that were expensive. And so you have a sense of her using embroidery and self-fashioning to create this image of the lady and this wealth that she didn't have. She has no money, but she has this sort of family that has it. And at the end of her life, in her inventory in her will, she has the embroidery boxes and multiple threads and sewing scissors. And so we can see this way that was probably an incredibly important, that clothing was a way to sort of claim a kind of economic status that she didn't really have. Mm-hmm.
And we were chatting a little bit too. A woman sewing in a room can easily recede into a political conversation that's happening in front of her while soaking it up and still being an observer and a student of it. It's a very interesting kind of social space to think about.
Yeah, and she's really sophisticated in her ads. One of the things the book really tries to do is get us to see the ads appreciating that so much vocabulary around women and women's education. We hear with the kind of denigrated diminutiveness that happens in the 19th century as male education becomes hard and women's education becomes finishing school, right? Mm-hmm. But she's at a moment where that hasn't happened. That really hasn't happened. And so she's so careful always in her advertisements to go in both directions, to say something in a way that will appeal to people who just want their daughter to have a little bit of this aspirational class and everything like that, while also she uses the word genius. She says, I'm going to give prizes, but everybody can only get one prize. But so she's always sort of moving in both directions at once. She has to make money. And so she always has to run her school in a way that will be appealing to the people who can afford to send her. And yet her school's always ambitious. Mm-hmm. And so there's that voice in her that you sort of can find.
Mm-hmm. We're going to open it up to questions in just a moment. So drop them in the chat if you're watching at home, or think about them for the next few minutes. But something that comes across in the book are all the women I met thanks to Eliza in Female Genius. And it's quite a train of worthies in terms of, public thinkers, artists, writers, women I hadn't totally met before. And as Eliza says, the exertions of a female should be considered, that should be the template, that should be the model. I wonder if in your research, you have kind of pinned, these are the women who need biographies next. Please go forth and research them here at the Historical Society.
Yeah. I mean, it's such a, there's so many amazing women we don't know because they published under a lady, right? And Jane Austen's first work was published as a lady. So if you think about the number of women authors of anonymous things, who, if you had a name to each of those things, how loud that voice would be. It's a lot of women. One of the things the book tries to do is take some names that are familiar to people, so Mary Wollstonecraft, Catherine Macaulay, women like that, and then weave them in with some other women and sort of explain how they're all examples of this moment pushing towards imagining a sort of end to female genius. So I think if there was one woman I would love to know more about, in the late summer of 1787, after Benjamin Rush Benjamin Rush tries to close down her school. He's very successful at that. There's a piece by a person called Cleo, the muse of history. Now it's also my dog's name. And she basically writes women, this editorial appears in the paper first in Boston and then in Philadelphia, and arguing for women getting higher education, able to do whatever they want. And I would love to know who that is. I mean, could it be Judith Murray? Possibly. It doesn't sound like her. We don't know. So that's like somebody ought to figure that out. In terms of women who I just think people should, if they haven't read about, I think Frances Wright, I think Maria Stuart, there's just so many women, particularly in the generation after her, who really occupy this space, imagining themselves as sort of capable of participating in politics. And one of the great things about Wikipedia that particularly efforts by women and people of color to make sure everybody has a Wikipedia entry is names that you might have not noticed. You can now look up and be like, wait, that's who that is. And so I think there's a way in which the kind of crowdsourcing around people who've been traditionally excluded through something like Wikipedia makes them much more present than they would have been in the days where you and I would have had to go and see if they made it into some big volume of a dictionary entry.
Yeah, and I think that libraries have done so much creative thinking about metadata and how to search for women. That's really evolved, I think, even recently, which has been a huge help. But we'd love to hear from all of you at Zoom and right here. Please go ahead.
I have a question which in a way follows on what you said about Benjamin Rush. I think you just said he was trying to close down her school. But what I was curious about was, you said she delayed so that Washington could attend her talk. What was the response or the comments of both men and women, but I guess I'm thinking mostly men, to the fact that this female was speaking at what today is the University of Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so she does do 5 lectures, so at least, so that means people kept buying her tickets for a while. The only, other than Washington, who thought she was tolerable, the other person I know specifically was young Noah Webster, who thought she was dull. But we have to take that in context, because Noah Webster had tried to give lectures. In fact, her lectures may be imitative of his, and he had failed miserably. And he had been panned in Philadelphia, and he also thought everybody was dull. So I went back to be like, is she really dull, or is this Noah Webster? And he went to the Columbia graduation speeches, and he said every single person was dull. And so he had said in his Philadelphia lectures that something that might look attractive on a young girl, a young miss of 15, would be unattractive on a lady in their 70s. And so he was totally panned. He was actually a terrible lecturer. So I know that about I know that as a response. Benjamin Rush is very interesting. She, after her lectures in Philadelphia that summer, she proposes having a French and English academy for women, governed by women by majority rule, with a woman who would always give lectures to 300 people. So basically imagining herself in a college. And she puts out a prospectus for that summer. And the book argues that Benjamin Rush's very famous, very influential thoughts on the education of basically women, which is the source for sometimes the Republican mother idea, was actually written to drive her out of business and to claim the type of education that he and his friends at the Young Ladies Academy thought was appropriate for women, which was a kind of constrained education. And if you read that very famous sort of classic text by Rush, you can see that every example he gives of how women should be educated is what he calls a peculiar form. He's constraining it each step of the way. And he explains because women should understand submission. He says, because they will be a better wife or daughter of an American citizen. And when you realize that she's Eliza Harriot, she's British, and she's married to an Irish Catholic man at a time when there's still enormous prejudice in this Irish Catholic, that wife and daughter of an American citizen feels a little bit differently. And her husband goes on to write a great kind of publicity piece for Washington, and he signs it citizen of America. And I always sort of feel like it's his own, like I'm getting back at Benjamin Rush, that way. So we don't have as many, we don't have as much commentary about it as, I would like. Maybe people will find out, more down the road, but it's a great question. Right here.
So after education, sort of the next point of progress for women was the ability to control their own property. And we see the Women's Properties Act in the mid-19th century. I'm wondering, as a woman who made money, do you have any idea what her views were about married women's right to control salaries or inherited income? And, was she public about that, or was that something, especially in the South, as a teacher, you might not want to say?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. And she, perhaps because her husband is Irish Catholic, her father sets up a separate trust for her to keep it out of her husband's hands. Now, it's not funded very well, but she has some possible small amount of income coming from that. But most of her story of her life is being caught in this exact thing about coverture. And every time she gets a school running, and she runs it, she gives the lectures to get the subscriptions, everything like that. He's always listed as and Mr. O'Connor might be teaching French or something. So he's there, but he's always off. He's got these big schemes. He's not around that much. They have to move again. And they're moving either because he has a new opportunity, or I think often to escape debts that he's raised. Escape debts. They're jumping state lines to escape debts. And in fact, one of the really poignant moments in the book is she gets herself invited to Mount Vernon. She writes Washington. She's teaching in Alexandria. She has a pretty good school going there. And she writes Washington and is like, can I come to Mount Vernon? I mean, it's pretty incredible. Can I come to Mount Vernon to talk with you and Mrs. Washington about the fact that my husband's leaving has left for Edenton, and I'm going to have to close my school. And Washington and Martha Washington are like, sure, you can come. And then she says, oh, I'd love to come. Thank you for the invitation, but I don't have a carriage. Oh. And then there's like, okay, fine, we'll send the carriage. Okay, so, it's pretty, she imagines herself, she's polite, but there's not the kind of deference that some people would give to Washington. And this is just a problem for her whole life, is being caught in this space. One of the things that I found really interesting is that she gives her ads. You can show that some of her ads and her ticket sales are placed with women printers. So Mary Catherine Goddard, who's in Baltimore, who's a woman printer who will print her name on the bottom of the Declaration of Independence, the first version that has the names. Has everyone seen that? That's like awesome. It's the version of the Declaration of Independence you would recognize. It has all the names of the signers. She was the first one to print the names of the signers. And then at the bottom, this is in the book because I love it so much, printed by Mary Catherine Goddard. And so, it's like right there. And she seems to find women and support women and be supported by other women who are trying to make money. But beyond that, I don't know completely how it is. But Mary Wollstonecraft, this is her whole argument for female education, it's one of the ways that women can earn money.
Gavin, I think we have a question from Zoom.
So this is from Zoom. It says, Siobhan asked, is there any evidence that Eliza Harriot lectured about legal topics? Did she learn about law or work in law in her husband's practice?
Yeah, it's such a great question. She doesn't seem to write about legal topics in the way we would think about legal topics that way. My own sense is if you're doing the prayer on Demosthenes, you have some notion of politics and reform politics, but she's mostly interested in the kinds of elocution, rhetoric studies that were seen as training for the bar in the kind of way that you would give public oratory. Her husband, to be fair, is not a very good lawyer. He goes to law school at a time when, for particularly the Irish, law school is a path towards politics. And almost like graduate education, like you go to law school, but you're not really studying the law. You're really getting to meet other people who will have political ambitions and think about politics. And he's very representative of he looks exactly like a lot of the Irish lawyers in the 1790s who go on to sort of be involved in early Irish reform efforts. At the very end of his life in Columbia, he does an ad that says, I'm kind of opening for law business. But what he means about that is he's going to just sort of file papers for people in land things. So he's not a lawyer. He never sort of embodies a lawyer in in that sense. He's that tells us something interesting about law isn't being used in the kind of practicing way that we might, like Stanton will learn law from her dad, and therefore will know law because of that. But Eliza Harriot doesn't seem to be that interested in that aspect. Please.
What sort of careers did women of the time make their mark in?
Yeah, so the pieces that the book really focuses on is first of all how teaching becomes a very important career possibility for women. Particularly, Eliza Harriot is married, but there will be women, particularly after her, who will not have to get married because they run schools. A very famous example of that will be Catherine Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's sister. So teaching will become a profession for women. Printing turns out to be an area where we see a lot of women. The paper that Eliza Harriot's advertisements most dominate in is run by a guy named Oswald, but he's gone a lot of the time. And his wife, who was the daughter of New York printers, Elizabeth Holt, actually seems to be printing a lot. So printing's another aspect for women, but once you get beyond that, there aren't a lot of options. Now that we're talking about for white women, for women of color, and elite women, for women of color, and for women who are not in this kind of aspirational gentry class of Eliza. There's a lot of jobs in terms of just such sort of subsistence jobs. And so you see, cook, seamstress, laundry, those kinds of domestic jobs within urban settings. And so, when we think like what jobs are for women, we have to sort of stop back and think like, well, who are we talking about in terms of women? And Mary Wollstonecraft has a wonderful, one of the things she writes about when she turns to thinking about should women be able to participate in politics is she gets there by thinking about women who are, as she puts it, sort of gently raised and well educated, but don't have any jobs. And then she says, well, maybe also we could have representation. So it's very much of a class and race-based question too. A really great question.
Gavin?
So we have another question from this is actually from Mary Beth. Thanks you for she says, do you know if the exams she gave were public and oral, as were some exams for girls, as I discovered when I researched Liberty's daughters, designed to show up the girls' learning, their parents and others. Maria J. John's daughter, were there experiencing such events?
Yeah, so it's a great point. She does oral exams, public oral exams, beginning in 1786 in New York. This is probably modeled out of Samuel White. In Dublin, there was an educator, Samuel White, who advocated the exam and the model of emulation. And it looks like her exams are very much in that tradition. She announces her exams in the newspaper, and she will list the girls' names. And so the fact that she gives exams is sort of publicized by her. And she will repeatedly do that for girls' education throughout that period. And so she's both giving the sort of opportunity for the girls themselves, but then she's always publicizing it across the papers. And this is a great moment to think about, I think, about the exam and the way that the exam is a way of putting girls out there. And so again, to think about Wollstonecraft, Wollstonecraft will write a book that she publishes under a pseudonym in 1788 called The Female Reader. And it's a group of selections for girls to basically learn to read out loud. And she argues that girls may need an excuse to what she calls obtrude themselves on the public. So what that means is you're thinking this becomes a way to show that women can speak in public. And one of the classic texts of this period is 1793, this remarkable text. I mean, I know Mary Beth knows it really well, by Priscilla Mason at the Young Ladies Academy, where ding, ding, I'll just let it finish doing it. Where Priscilla Mason, Carolyn Eastman talks about how it's probably the most dramatic, impassioned of these speeches. It's the one that we know sort of it gets collected. And this is 5 years after Eliza Harriot's tried to run her school after she's done her oratory. And Priscilla Mason, who's probably 15 or 16 years old, gets up to a room probably largely of men at a school where the Young Ladies Academy, where the front of those notebooks said you should not sort of aim to have any ambition beyond, you don't have any ambition, you should just stay, get educated, but don't have ambition. And Mason basically says, the doors are closed to us. Yeah. And who shut them, right? Man, yeah. Despotic man. And why can't we be a senator or a lawyer? I'm paraphrasing, right? And then she says, if we get educated, those doors will open to us. And so that's a moment where the exam, the public exam, becomes actually a way to show that you have the capacity to participate in the political state. That's going to get closed down. It's so important to realize, that's all gonna, Rosie Zagari's Backlash book, I think, has it exactly right about after 1792, things reverse, and they reverse very quickly, and these new written constitutions become a tool that is exceptionally powerful to end this. Because once you put in a constitution language that says only white male citizens can participate, you've closed that box down. And there's a lot of work now on the 19th century that shows us how in this early decades, the end of the 1790s into the very beginning of the 1800s, constitution after constitution gets written with this language that excludes based on gender and usually also on race. And that is what then sets up people like the women's activists in the 19th century to try and argue that that they should be enfranchised. But it's really important to realize that the argument about enfranchisement is made a certain way because the original Constitution is written in a gender neutral way. It's not written the way the Massachusetts Constitution was, which included the word male. So the argument for women's activists in some ways is made more possible by this aspirational way of reading the Constitution to include them.
Mm-hmm. And that's absolutely true, that you have this wave of state constitution renovation that happens in the first couple of decades of the 19th century. And I'm thinking particularly of, the work of the Colored Conventions Project, right? So where African-American men and women reclaim those spaces, right, to protest the change. And it's really, I think, kind of thanks to path-breaking women like Eliza Harriot to tell them to go out and remake the public sphere in their own kind of political mold. So we thank you. We thank Mary Sarah Bilder for sharing female genius.
Thank you.